My name is Elena Ward. I'm 34 years old, from Richmond, Virginia. I work in nonprofit consulting, mostly focused on education funding. It's not glamorous, but it pays well and it means something, which, frankly, is more than I can say for most of what I grew up around. The dinner invitation came through a group text from my brother. No explanation, no warmth, just a date, a time, and a vague "Dad wants everyone here." Still, I went, maybe out of habit, maybe hope. When I walked into the dining room, I noticed it right away. My name wasn't on a place card. Everyone else had one, hand-lettered, carefully arranged around the table. Mine was missing. No one mentioned it. My sister just slid a chair over, said, "You can sit here," and went back to pouring wine. I smiled, said thank you, sat down. That's how it usually went. Small signs, brushed off as accidents. A name left off a list. A gift that didn't match the others. A laugh that didn't quite reach me. I'd learned to let it slide, to tell myself it didn't mean anything. But that night, something was different. Or maybe I was. As I looked around the table, watching them pass dishes and tell each other stories I was never part of, I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger. Exactly. Just recognition. They'd stopped pretending. And for the first time, I noticed I had too. The meal itself was quiet at first. Forks scraping plates, glasses clinking. My mother asked about the weather, and someone laughed. At a work story my brother told something about a client mix-up. I smiled at the right times. Kept my hands folded in my lap. No one asked how I'd been. Halfway through the main course, my father set his fork down. The sound of metal on china was sharper than it needed to be. He didn't clear his throat or build up to it. He just said it, like it had been waiting for its moment. "You're not really family anymore." That was it. 7 words. Spoken like he was naming a new menu item. I didn't flinch. Not outwardly, but inside. Everything stilled. No one said a word. My sister stared at her plate. My brother reached for the salt, like nothing had happened. My mother looked toward the window, not at me. It was the kind of silence that tells you everything you need to know, not just about what was said, but about what they all agreed not to say. I took a slow sip of water. Swallowed around it. My heart was pounding, but my face didn't move. There wasn't a scene. There was no confrontation. Just a statement, delivered like a fact. And a table full of people who didn't find it strange. I'd always known I wasn't truly one of them, but that night, they made it official, not through law or paperwork, but through silence, and somehow, that felt more permanent than anything written. After that moment, no one addressed it. No one asked my father what he meant. No one asked me how I felt. The conversation simply moved on, as if I hadn't just been cut loose from the family in a single sentence. I sat there, physically present but emotionally erased. They passed the breadbasket around me. My brother made a joke about real estate. My sister laughed too loudly. It was all so normal. That's what hit me the hardest. Not the words, but the way everyone accepted them, like background noise, like this had already been decided, and the only thing left was to carry on as though I was never really part of the script. I didn't speak. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't humiliate me further. Every breath felt like I was swallowing gravel, the kind of pain that doesn't draw attention, but stays with you long after you leave the room. I watched my father cut into his roast. Calm as ever, as though exiling me had cost him nothing, and maybe it hadn't. But for me, it was like watching a door close. Slowly, firmly, and realizing everyone else had already walked through it without me. And worse, they never looked back. They talked about vacation plans. Next, my brother was heading to Italy with his wife, something about a vineyard tour and rented villa. My sister was planning a home renovation. New floors, a skylight in the hallway. They debated paint colors, laughed about contractors, traded tips like nothing had happened. I sat there listening, nodding when appropriate, but it was like watching a play I hadn't been cast in. Not once did anyone circle back to what my father had said. Not a single question. Not even a glance in my direction to check if I was okay. It was clear now, this wasn't a slip of the tongue or some spontaneous cruelty. They had talked about it beforehand, agreed on it, chosen silence together. And now they were just moving forward, making plans, sharing toasts, cutting me out of the story like I'd only ever been written in pencil. That realization, more than the sentence, more than the silence, was what broke something inside me, because in that moment, I understood. This wasn't the beginning of my exclusion, it was the end of my illusion. I left without saying goodbye. No one tried to stop me. No hugs at the door. No one asked if I'd made it home safe later that night. It was as if my presence had never been required and my absence would be just as easy to absorb. The drive home was silent. No music. No thoughts I could hold on to. Just long stretches of road blurred by headlights and a mind that couldn't quite settle. I kept replaying the moment over and over, not just the words, but the expressions, the small glances passed between them. The way no one looked surprised. It wasn't an outburst. It was confirmation, and that, somehow, was worse. I thought about other moments, subtle ones I'd ignored. Holidays where I was asked to take the group photo, never be in it. Texts that went quiet after I joined. Decisions, made without me, spun as accidents. It had been building for years. I used to tell myself I was overthinking it, that families are complicated. And love looks different in different homes. But tonight proved something. I didn't want to admit until now. I had never been seen as one of them. I had only been tolerated, and even that had an expiration date, and now, it had passed. When I got home, I didn't go straight to bed. I stood in my kitchen for a while. Coat still on, staring at nothing. The silence there felt different, not cold like the dinner table, but still, heavy, familiar. Eventually, I walked to the back closet and unlocked the safe I hadn't touched in over a year. Inside were only a few things, old documents, a letter from my grandfather I never opened, and the envelope he gave me 2 months before he passed. I hadn't looked at it since. Not because I forgot, but because, at the time, it felt too big to hold. Now, I pulled it out. It was thick, cream paper, handwritten, signed and notarized. His will, the real one. It named me as his primary heir. Not out of pity, not as a token gesture, but in full. He had told me quietly one evening, sitting beside me in the sunroom. He said he'd already made the decision. Said I reminded him of his sister, strong, decent, and often overlooked. He said he trusted me to carry forward what he built. I remembered that now. Word for word. And yet, at the reading, this version of the will never surfaced. The version we were shown had a different story. A different ending. One that left me out entirely. I had never said anything. Not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. But now, holding the original in my hands, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in months. I wasn't imagining things. I hadn't been mistaken. He saw me, and someone else had tried to erase that. I placed the will on the kitchen table. There was no dramatic gesture, no slamming it down, no tears. Just the soft sound of paper meeting wood. I stood there for a while, staring at it, like it might say something new if I waited long enough. But I already knew what it meant. This wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about place, about presence, about someone choosing to believe in me, quietly, in a way no one else ever had, and someone else choosing to bury that truth. I didn't feel anger, not yet. What I felt was something colder still, like a door had finally closed, and I no longer needed to knock on it. For so long, I had tried to be what they might one day love. I'd overextended myself. I'd explained away the slights. I'd told myself that maybe, if I worked hard enough, I could become impossible to overlook. But that night, sitting at my own table, I felt something shift. I didn't want back in. I didn't want a seat at their table anymore. They had drawn the line, neatly, deliberately, and now, I chose to stay on the other side. I think some things settle in your bones before you even have words for them. When I was little, maybe 5, 6 years old, I remember birthdays at our house. Streamers, cake, cousins, running around. My siblings always had carefully wrapped gifts, ones that matched their interests exactly. My brother loved puzzles. My sister, dolls with matching outfits. Their gifts reflected that. Mine always felt off. A book I already had. A toy meant for someone younger. Once, a gift card tucked into a plain white envelope. No name on it. I remember my mother saying, "Well, we weren't sure what you liked." But I'd lived there for years by then. I'd told them. I just didn't say it loud. Or maybe they weren't listening at school events. My parents would show up, proud, smiling, when I introduced them to teachers or friends. My father always had a way of slipping in the word adopted, not cruelly, just factually. "This is our adopted daughter, Elena." I don't think I understood what that word really meant until much later, but even as a child, I felt what it did to a room. A soft shift in tone. An invisible label, right? Across my chest. It wasn't that I was unloved. It was that I was conditionally loved. There's a difference, and once you know it, it's hard to unfeel. It's hard to unfeel. By the time I hit middle school, I'd already figured out that being good wasn't enough. I had to be better, so I made myself useful. I got straight A's, never missed an assignment. I said please and thank you without being reminded. I set the table, helped my siblings with their homework, and ironed my own clothes. No one asked me to. I just thought, maybe if I kept proving my worth, someone would notice it. Sometimes, they did. My mother would say things like, "Elena's the responsible one," when guests were over. My father would mention my grades, if they were exceptional, but it always felt like commentary, never connection. I remember once, I stayed up late helping my sister build her science project. She got second place at the regional fair. My father took her out for dinner to celebrate. I wasn't invited. When I asked about it later, he just said, she was the one who got the award. So I worked harder. I learned to disappear behind effort. To keep giving more, without asking for much. Because somewhere, in the back of my mind, I believed that love in my family was something you earned, and that maybe, if I performed well enough, they'd forget to treat me like a guest. But no matter how well I did, it always felt like I was on borrowed time. Like I had to keep reapplying for a place at the table. And after a while, I stopped believing I'd ever be given one. My father was never unkind. That's what made it harder to explain. He was polite, composed, always proper. The kind of man who shook hands firmly, kept his calendar in ink, and sent out thank you notes after funerals. He did the right thing publicly. But there was a difference between being cared for and being claimed. I don't think he ever claimed me. He never raised his voice at me, never called me names, but he also never let his guard down. His compliments were rare, and when they came, they felt like performance reviews. You did well. That was efficient, good presentation, always from a distance. When we were out in public, I was introduced as the adopted one. Not in a cruel way, just a quiet, consistent distinction. It was never, "This is my daughter Elena." It was always Elena, who we adopted when she was 2, like that preface made everything clearer, more comfortable for him somehow. I learned to brace for it, to fill the silence after with a joke. Or a smile, or a quick shift in topic, anything to keep the air moving. But I felt the gap, always. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was there, a space between us that I couldn't cross, no matter how well I behaved. He let me exist in his house. He just never made space for me. In his heart, my siblings never excluded me outright. That would have made it easier, honestly. At least then I could have named it. Instead, I was always included just enough to stay on the edges, invited to family trips, group photos, birthday dinners. But when they told stories, I was never in them. When they laughed about childhood, memories, I wasn't the punchline. I wasn't even there. Sometimes I'd remind them. Gently, actually, I was there for that one. They'd pause, smile politely, and say something like, "Oh right," before moving on. It wasn't malicious, just practiced. They called each other nicknames. Shared glances when our parents argued, knew the shorthand of people who had always belonged to each other. I knew the choreography. I'd learned it, but I hadn't grown up in it. I remember being in the car once, on the way back from a family outing. They were laughing about something my brother did when he was little. My sister turned around to include me in the story, then hesitated like she realized I wouldn't get the reference and pivoted back to him. I laughed anyway. That's what I did. I played sister. I knew when to smile, when to nod, when to make myself part of a moment that was never built with me in mind. It's strange how belonging can look almost identical to pretending, if you're careful enough. And for years, my grandfather was the only one who never made me feel like I had to try so hard. He wasn't loud, and he wasn't particularly warm in a traditional way, but when I was with him, I didn't feel like I had to audition for affection. He never treated me like a project or an outsider. I was just there, and that was enough for him. He'd slip me notes sometimes, little scraps of paper folded into the books he loaned me. Things like, "Keep your eyes open. You see more than most, or not everyone who whispers has something worth hearing." He never explained them, just left them like breadcrumbs I could follow back to myself. I don't think he ever said, "I love you," out loud, but he showed it in ways that felt quieter and truer. When I had a school recital, he came early and stayed late even when my father didn't. When I was sick, he brought tea and sat nearby without needing to speak. When I got my first job, he handed me a fountain pen and said, "Sign things that matter." He never mentioned that I was adopted. Not once. Not in stories. Not in introductions. To him, I was simply his granddaughter. And when the house felt cold, when everyone else seemed to look through me, I'd find my way to his study and just sit with him. We didn't need to say much. His presence said the thing I'd been aching to hear my whole life. You belong here, and I never had to be convinced. My grandfather's study was the only room in that house where I didn't feel like I was being observed. It wasn't fancy shelves of old books, a worn leather chair, a lamp with a crooked shade he refused to replace. The wallpaper peeled at the corners, and it always smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and paper. But to me, it felt sacred. I'd sit on the floor sometimes, flipping through atlases, or tracing my fingers along the spines of books he let no one else touch. He never asked why I came. Never questioned how long I stayed. He just kept doing whatever he was doing, reading, writing, thinking, and let me be there with him. In that room, I didn't have to explain myself. I didn't have to perform. I didn't feel like someone trying to fit into a space that wasn't made for her. I just existed. Fully. Safely. He never said things like you're just like them or you're one of us. That wasn't his way. Instead, he'd hand me a book he thought I'd like or slide over a cup of tea without a word. And in those moments, I understood something no one else in that family had taught me. Belonging isn't granted by ceremony. It's felt in stillness, in being allowed to take up space without having to earn it. And in that small cluttered room, I was never on trial. My grandfather didn't make big speeches. He wasn't the kind of man who made declarations or raised his voice to be heard. When he wanted me to know something, he'd say it in a moment, so quiet, I often wondered if I was the only one truly listening. I remember one evening in particular. We were sitting out back, watching the sun go down behind the trees. I must have been around 24. I had just started a new job, and the family hadn't really asked about it. But he did. He always asked. That night, as we sat there, he leaned back and said, almost like he was just thinking out loud, I want to make sure you're okay after I'm gone. I looked at him and smiled, thinking it was one of those sentimental things old men say, but he was serious. He added, you won't have to fight for it. It's already written. I asked him what he meant, but he didn't go into details. He just said, you'll understand when the time comes. It was the kind of statement you carry with you, even if you don't fully believe it. Part comfort, part question. At the time, I didn't know how much I'd come to depend on those words, or how painful it would be when the rest of the family acted like he never said them at all. The will was read in my father's study. They'd cleared the books off the table and lined up the chairs like it was a board meeting. Everything about it felt sterile, polished wood, stiff postures, legal phrasing that seemed designed to keep emotion at bay. I remember walking into that room and knowing immediately, I didn't belong there, not in the way they did. My siblings were already seated, murmuring to each other in low tones. My father stood near the window, arms folded. When I entered, no one greeted me. No one even made space. The attorney began reading. His voice was steady, professional, indifferent, and as the paragraphs unfolded, so did the version of my grandfather's will that none of us had supposedly seen until that moment. Except, they didn't look surprised. Everything, the house, the business shares, the investments, was divided between my father and his biological children. I wasn't mentioned. Not once. Not even in a side note, or a line, about equal love shown elsewhere. I sat still, heart pounding in a way that didn't show. I didn't ask questions. I didn't interrupt. I just stared at the page in front of me, the words blurring into one long confirmation. When the reading ended, my brother leaned back and stretched. My sister checked her phone. My father poured himself a drink, like a man whose plans had gone exactly as expected. And in that moment, I realized something no one had said out loud. This wasn't a surprise to them, but it was meant to look like one to me. For a while, I convinced myself I had imagined it all. Maybe my grandfather hadn't meant what I thought he said. Maybe he changed his mind and just never told me. Maybe he left something informal, something that wasn't binding. I played every possible explanation over and over until the lie felt softer than the truth. I didn't ask questions. Not because I was afraid of answers, but because I already knew what silence would meet me if I did. And I wasn't ready to be dismissed again. Not so soon, so I smiled when they moved his things into storage. I nodded along when my sister claimed the grandfather clock he used to polish every Sunday. I watched as my father handed over the keys to the lake cabin, the one my grandfather took me to every summer, and said, he would have wanted you to have this. I wanted to say, He told me it was mine. But I didn't single quotes T. Instead. I stood quietly in the background, like I always had. The difference now was, I wasn't just being overlooked, I was being erased. And the worst part was, I almost let them. Because for weeks after that reading, I held on to one thought tighter than anything else. Maybe he just didn't love me the way I thought he did. It wasn't something I was looking for. I was moving apartments, folding boxes, sorting through drawers that hadn't been opened in years. Most of it was old paperwork, notebooks half filled with lists I never finished. A few photographs I wasn't sure why I'd kept. And then, underneath a bundle of scarves in my old piano bench, I felt something stiff and folded, tucked between the lining and the wood. It was an envelope, thick heavy paper with my name written in his handwriting. Just Elena, no last name, no title, just mine. I sat there for a long time before opening it. Part of me was afraid it would be something ordinary, something unimportant, something that wouldn't justify the way I'd been holding on to the memory of his voice, his promises, his quiet loyalty. But it wasn't ordinary, it was his will, not a copy. The original. Notarized, dated, signed, and in it, he named me as the primary heir, not in vague language or small gestures. Full ownership of the cabin, a controlling share of the trust, personal effects, accounts, the things he had spent his life building, passed to me directly. I sat on the floor, hands shaking because in that one moment, everything I had been doubting, everything I'd been gaslit into second-guessing, was suddenly real. He hadn't forgotten me. He had protected me, and someone else had buried that truth, literally. I held that document like it was fragile, not because the paper was thin. It wasn't, but because of what it confirmed. All those quiet moments with my grandfather, all the subtle ways he made me feel seen, remembered, valued. They hadn't been just kindness. They had been intention. This wasn't a symbolic gift. It was a legal declaration of trust, of care, of belonging. And as that truth sank in, something else followed slower. Heavier. Grief, not just for him, but for the version of my family I'd been trying to preserve in my mind. The one that might have made a mistake, misunderstood, gotten lost in logistics. The version where what happened to me wasn't planned, but now, holding that original will, I knew better. He had tried to protect me. He had put it in writing, and someone I grew up calling father, had chosen to ignore that. They didn't just cut me out. They cut him out of his own final word. And as I sat there, with the will resting across my lap, I realized this wasn't just proof of what he left me, it was proof that I hadn't made it all up, and proof that someone else had worked very hard to make me believe I had pulled out the copy of the will they'd shown us at the reading. It was still in the folder I'd taken home, untouched. I'd kept it, not out of trust, but because something in me had known. And now, with both documents side by side, the differences were undeniable. The language was similar, but the structure was off. The signatures were copied, not original. The dates were only a few weeks apart, but the second version stripped away everything that mattered. My name, my share, my place. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an administrative update, or a mix-up, or some latent life change of heart. It was a decision. Deliberate, calculated, legal on the surface, but morally bankrupt underneath. I felt it land slowly. The weight of it. Someone had taken my name out of something that was mine. Not because I didn't deserve it, but because they knew I did. And that made it inconvenient. This wasn't just about money. It never had been. It was about the story they wanted to tell without me in it. And they'd told it so neatly. I almost believed it, until now. Now I knew the truth, and knowing it was the first time I felt steady in months. I didn't tell anyone. Not my siblings, not my parents, not even my closest friend. I held on to the will like it was a secret too big for air, and maybe part of me wasn't ready to share it. Not yet, not after everything they'd already taken. So I went to the next family gathering like nothing had changed. I smiled when they passed around baby photos and travel updates. I clapped politely when my brother shared news about a real estate deal, nodding along as if I hadn't read the balance sheet that proved it had been funded from the account my grandfather had originally meant for me. They passed down wine glasses and laughed across me. I let them. I listened as my sister gushed about redesigning the lake cabin, his cabin. The one I knew he left to me. She talked about painting over the old pine walls, replacing the windows he had installed himself. I sipped my drink and said nothing. There was power in that silence. Not the kind they would notice, but the kind I could finally feel. Because, even though I hadn't said a word, I knew something they didn't. They were building futures on stolen ground, and I was quietly holding the deed. The next gathering happened without me. No. One told me there was a brunch for Dad's birthday. I only found out when my cousin posted a photo on social media, everyone dressed in pastels, seated around the big table at the country club. Even my father's second cousin from Ohio was there. IWASN single quotes. No one texted. No one apologized. No one even acted like they noticed. At first, I told myself it was a mistake. Maybe the message didn't go through. Maybe they thought I was busy. But when it kept happening, one event, then another, the pattern became harder to deny. Group pictures, shared stories, matching t-shirts from some family getaway. All of it posted publicly, but never sent privately. I was being left out, on purpose. And the worst part, it felt easy for them. I didn't cause a scene. I didn't beg for answers. I simply watched from a distance as they redrew the family circle, one I was no longer in. It hurt, yes, but not in the way people think. It wasn't the absence that broke me. It was realizing that the absence didn't break them. I didn't notice it all at once. At first, it was small things, forgetting to return emails, showing up late to meetings, staring at my screen for hours without typing a word. I'd always been dependable, organized. But suddenly, everything felt heavier to carry. At work, I missed a grant deadline I would have normally tripped. My supervisor asked if everything was all right. I said yes. I smiled. I blamed it on a busy month. But I could see the shift, the quiet doubt in their eyes. The subtle drop in how much I was trusted. Friends reached out to. Invites for coffee, texts, checking in. I answered with emojis or short replies, then left them unread for days. I didn't know how to explain the kind of loneliness I was carrying, the kind that doesn't make noise, but drains everything. Some nights, I sat in my apartment with the lights off, scrolling through my phone like a habit I couldn't quit, looking for a message that wouldn't come, listening for the silence that now felt like its own kind of answer. It wasn't about the will anymore, it was about wondering whether I had ever truly belonged, not just in the inheritance, but in the family, in the stories, in the memories. I'd spent years building my life to prove I was enough, and now that the scaffolding had been kicked out from under me, I wasn't sure what was left. I just knew something was slipping, and I didn't know how to stop the fall. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. I almost didn't answer. I didn't recognize the number, and I wasn't in the mood to talk, but something made me swipe instead of decline. The voice on the other end was soft, deliberate, older, measured. It took me a second to place it. Elena, it's Martin Lowell. I used to work with your grandfather. His name brought up something solid in my chest. Martin had been my grandfather's lawyer, semi-retired. If I remembered right, he was the one who used to stop by the house with folders and manila envelopes, always wearing the same navy blazer and brown loafers. No matter the season. He didn't sound like a man chasing a client. He sounded like someone checking in. I heard a few things about the estate. I don't want to intrude, but if there's ever anything you'd like to talk through, I'm still around. He didn't offer legal advice. Didn't press for details, just left the door open, quietly, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something shift. Not anger, not hope, just a small relief. The kind that comes when someone remembers your name, not because they need something from you, but because they still believe it matters. I thanked him. I didn't say much more. But when we hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand a while longer. That voice, calm, steady, unfazed, it didn't sound surprised to hear from me. It sounded like someone who already knew I'd been wronged. I didn't even know what I was hoping to get out of the visit. Martin had invited me to stop by his home office. No pressure, no timeline, just a quiet offer. So I went. Not because I had a plan, but because I needed someone to hear it who didn't already have a reason to look away. His place was simple: bookshelves, paperweights, old photos in thin frames. Nothing flashy, just a man who had lived a long life paying attention. I sat across from him and told the story, slowly, carefully. About the reading, about the silence, about the will I found, and the one they used. I watched his face the entire time, waiting for that familiar flicker, disbelief, caution, polite deflection, but it never came. He didn't interrupt. He didn't ask if I was sure. He didn't suggest I speak. To my father first. To my father first. He just listened. And when I was done, he leaned back and said quietly, "Grief makes people loud. But the truth doesn't need volume. It just needs patience." He didn't tell me what to do. He didn't make it about revenge or legacy or proving anything. What he gave me was simpler and far more valuable. He believed me, fully, quietly, without question, and after months of being doubted or worse, ignored. That was the one thing I didn't know I'd needed so badly. That night, for the first time in months, I didn't fall asleep replaying conversations I never got to have. There were no imaginary confrontations, no mental drafts of emails I'd never send. Just a quiet kind of stillness. Like something inside me had finally stopped pacing. I didn't have a plan yet. I didn't know what I was going to do with the will, or the proof, or the weight of everything I now carried. But for the first time, I didn't feel like I was carrying it alone. It's strange how much of pain is made worse by the silence that follows it, the space where no one steps in, no one acknowledges, no one sees. That's what isolation really is. Not physical distance, emotional erasure. But Martin had seen me. Without needing to fix me, without needing me to justify a thing, and that simple recognition, that steady, unshaken belief felt like the first solid ground I'd stood on in a long time. The collapse hadn't ended, not completely. I was still sorting through what was broken, what could be repaired, and what should be left behind. But something in me had shifted. I didn't feel invisible anymore. And that was enough to start breathing again. I didn't storm into my father's office or send a furious email to the family group thread. I didn't shout. I didn't demand answers. Because by then, I already understood something important. Rage wouldn't give me what I needed. Not from people who had spent years pretending they couldn't hear me. What I wanted wasn't noise. It was clarity. And later, when the time was right, I wanted accountability. But first, I needed to think, not react, so I stayed quiet. But this time, not from fear, from control. I made a list. I pulled out every version of the documents I had. The copy of the forged will. The original my grandfather left for me. Letters he'd written. Dates I remembered. Small facts that had once felt like memories, but now looked like evidence. And then I started looking into what came next. How to do this without it becoming a spectacle, without becoming the angry daughter, the outsider causing problems, the emotional one they could all dismiss. No, this would be slow, measured, precise. I wasn't planning revenge. I was preparing for truth. Before I could do anything else, I had to be certain. Not emotionally certain. Legally, so I took the will to a document examiner, a small office recommended quietly by Martin. No big firm. No paper trail. Just someone whose job was to confirm if what I had held up. He reviewed the notary seal, checked the signature against known samples, verified the registration stamp, the paper quality, the date formats, every detail, and then he looked at me and said, plainly, this is valid, no hesitation, no disclaimers, just, this holds weight. And something inside me steadied, because even though I had always felt the truth, I had learned, painfully, that feelings rarely held up in rooms filled with cold authority. What mattered here was proof. And now, I had it. This wasn't just a letter from a loving grandfather. It wasn't a private gesture or a family memory I'd romanticized. It was a binding, legal document, signed, sealed, intentional. He meant for me to have it. And now I had confirmation that what they did to erase me, wasn't just immoral, it was unlawful. And that changed everything. I asked Martin if he knew anyone who handled cases like this. Quietly he gave me a name, then a second. He told me which ones to avoid, who would keep it out of the papers, who wouldn't posture, who would listen. That's how I met Rachel. She wasn't flashy, no designer suits or loud confidence. Just a legal mind sharp enough to slice through the layers without drawing blood. She reviewed everything I brought her, the real will, the forged one, my grandfather's notes, the timelines. She didn't flinch, didn't overpromise. She said, we'll move carefully, let them underestimate you. I liked her immediately. Over the next few weeks, we quietly assembled a team, a retired forensic analyst, a probate specialist, a researcher who pulled transaction records going back 10 years. They didn't treat me like a victim, or worse, like a naive woman in over her head. They treated me like a client. One with a case. One with leverage. While the rest of the family went on with their lives, upgrading kitchens, buying lake boats, toasting inheritances, I was building a file. Labeled folders, chronological entries, copies of emails, tax filings, property deeds, nothing loud, nothing vengeful, just facts, bound together in silence. And every day, As that file grew thicker, something in me began to shift again. This wasn't just about what they had taken. It was about what I was finally reclaiming, not with force, but with focus. Somewhere in the middle of spreadsheets and legal drafts, I realized I hadn't cooked a real meal in weeks. I'd been surviving on granola bars, coffee, and the occasional takeout container I left half-finished on my desk. I wasn't sleeping well. I wasn't moving. I wasn't really in my body at all, just floating somewhere above the mess. Trying to stay functional, so I made a different kind of list. It wasn't about evidence or timelines. It was simple: eat, sleep, move, drink water, talk to someone. That week, I booked a therapy session for the first time in years. I didn't go in looking for healing or answers. I just wanted a place where I didn't have to pretend I was fine, somewhere I could let the pressure ease even just a little. I started walking again. Not fast, not far. Just enough to feel like the world hadn't completely closed in. I turned off notifications. I cooked dinner one night, real food, with actual spices, and sat down to eat it without rushing. I didn't feel better right away, but I began to feel present again, inside my own skin, in control of the smallest things, even if the big things were still unraveling. I wasn't fixed, but I was showing up for myself, and that felt like something worth protecting. I used to feel like I owed people an explanation. Why I was quiet, why I didn't show up, why I seemed distracted at work, why I didn't call back. I'd wrap my grief in something digestible so no one felt uncomfortable sitting next to it. But at some point, I got tired of translating my pain for other people's comfort, because the truth is, it wasn't the kind of pain you could sum up in a sentence or two. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was layered, constant, and shaped like silence. And explaining it never changed anything, so I stopped. I stopped telling friends why I pulled away from my family. I stopped softening the details to make it sound like a misunderstanding. I stopped offering proof to people who never really listened. I didn't shut down. I just stopped needing to be understood by those who hadn't earned the right to understand me. There's a quiet kind of power in that. Not hiding. Not pretending. Just no longer performing for approval I never needed in the first place. They took a lot from me. But I realized one of the most dangerous things they took was the belief that I had to justify my hurt. I don't owe them that anymore, and I never did. When I was younger, I used to think power looked like speaking last, in a room. The one who slammed the door, the one who delivered the final, cutting line that made everyone go silent. I thought power had to be loud to be real, but now I was starting to understand it differently. Power, I was learning, is quiet. It's sitting in a room full of people who once dismissed you and letting them feel the weight of your silence, not your fury. It's having the truth and choosing when to let it speak, not because you're afraid, but because you no longer need to prove anything. That's what this process was becoming for me. Not a battle, not a spectacle, but a quiet reclaiming, of voice, of space, of legacy. The will was real. The evidence was ready. The legal team had quietly filed the initial notices. No press. No family announcement. Just careful, strategic movement, inch by inch. I wasn't preparing for a showdown. I was preparing for stillness, because when the moment came, I didn't want to fight. I wanted to watch them realize I'd already won, not by force, but by fact, not with vengeance, but with vision, and not because I had finally become powerful, but because I'd stopped giving that power away. We filed the motion on a Tuesday. There were no announcements, no family warnings, no dramatic confrontations or last-minute texts. Just a simple, quiet submission to the probate court. A packet of documents that told the story in signatures, stamps, and timelines. The original will was attached. Verified. Complete. No arguments. No interpretations. Rachel and her team took care of the language. Legal. Direct. Clean. It said what needed to be said, that my grandfather's final instructions had been disregarded, and that I had the proof to correct that. It didn't need emotion. It didn't need me to justify how much it hurt. It just needed the truth documented, submitted, and carried by people who understood how to fight without making noise. I didn't send a message to my father. I didn't warn my siblings. I knew they'd find out soon enough, and I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of reacting to me. This wasn't about being seen anymore. It was about being recognized. Legally. I felt nervous. Of course I did. But it wasn't the shaky, uncertain fear I used to feel. It was something steadier, like walking into a room you used to be afraid of. only to realize you no longer needed anyone to let you in. The court notices went out a week later. I didn't hear from anyone directly, but I knew when they received them. The family group chat, once filled with daily updates, vacation photos, and shallow birthday wishes, went completely silent. No messages, no calls, not even a snide remark passed through mutual relatives. Just a sudden, collective pause. They weren't outraged. That would have been easier to handle. Instead, they were quiet, controlled, like people realizing they had underestimated the one person they never expected to do anything at all, and in their silence, I saw something I'd never seen from them before. Uncertainty. They built their confidence on the assumption that I wouldn't push back, that I'd stay polite, stay quiet, maybe even stay grateful for being allowed in the background. They didn't think I'd take action, and they definitely didn't expect me to do it like this. Not messily, not loudly, but legally, properly, with facts they couldn't spin. It wasn't rage that unsettled them, it was restraint. I wasn't showing up at their doorstep demanding apologies. I was holding up a mirror and letting the system reflect what they'd tried to erase. And that, I think, shook them more than anything I could have said. I didn't speak at the hearing. Rachel told me I didn't need to. Everything was already in the file. The original will, the forensic analysis, the timeline, the bank records. No speculation, no family drama. Just a clear, documented paper trail that told the truth better than I ever could. There was no trial. No dramatic scene where I confronted anyone in a courtroom. Just a judge, a bench, and the law quietly doing what it was supposed to do. The forgery was obvious. The discrepancies were undeniable. My grandfather's intent was clear, his signature, the notary, the formatting, all in line. The forged version, cleanly executed, yes, but not authentic. And now, legally proven to be invalid. A few weeks later, the ruling came down. The estate would be restructured, the assets whereasings and my rights, finally recognized. I didn't cry. I didn't celebrate either. I just sat with the ruling in my lap for a long time, reading it over and over, like it might dissolve if I looked away. It didn't feel like winning, it felt like being restored. Not everything could be fixed, the years of being overlooked, the silence, the betrayal, but this was something solid, something official. Something that couldn't be denied or edited or explained away at a dinner table. The court didn't need a story. It needed the truth. And for once, that was enough. The paperwork came in pieces. First, the property titles. Then, access to the trust. Then confirmation from the bank that control had officially transferred. My name, printed where theirs used to be. I expected it to feel like victory, some big emotional release, but it didn't. It felt quiet, almost too quiet. I walked through the cabin 1 week later, the same one my sister had bragged about remodeling. Nothing had changed. The same pine walls, the same creaky floorboard near the kitchen. His coffee mug still hanging by the sink. It smelled like dust and cedar, and for the first time, it felt like it belonged to me in more than just memory. Not because the deed said so, but because I had earned this. Not through performance. Not through begging. Through truth, and the choice to protect it. I didn't feel proud in the way people often describe. I felt steady. Like I was finally anchored to something that couldn't be taken from me by a withheld invitation or a look across the table. This wasn't about money. It was about being written out and writing myself back in. And as I stood, in that space, surrounded by the stillness my grandfather always treasured, I realized something I hadn't fully grasped until that moment. I hadn't just inherited land or funds, I'd inherited the right to know. Longer explain myself, and I wasn't giving that up again. I didn't send threats. There were no ultimatums, no bold declarations, no statements beginning with effective immediately. That's not how I wanted to handle it. That's not who I wanted to be. Instead, I sent letters. One to each of them, my father, my brother, my sister, short, formal. Measured, I told them the estate had been corrected under the law. I confirmed that the original will, my grandfather's real will, was now being honored in full. I explained, plainly, what that meant in terms of property, trusts, and control. Then I offered them a choice. They could remain in any shared spaces under new terms, with legal clarity, or, if they preferred, I would offer a fair buyout for their relocation. No disruption, no eviction, just dignity. Because that's what I wanted for myself. And what I refused to withhold from others, even the ones who had done exactly that to me. I knew they'd expect something colder, maybe harsher, But I wasn't seeking retribution. I was offering accountability, the kind they'd never thought they'd need. It wasn't a warning, it was closure. Typed in clean paragraphs, sealed in envelopes with my name, not in the corner, but at the top, and that alone said everything. The responses came slowly. No one called. No one came knocking. Just envelopes and return mail, short emails, a message forwarded through someone else. Each one cautious, clipped, almost clinical. There were no apologies, no explanations, no attempts to justify what had happened or how they had behaved, but also, no resistance. They agreed to the terms, quietly, formally, without contest, and that silence spoke volumes. Because for once, they didn't try to talk over me. They didn't try to shift blame or rewrite the narrative. They didn't even try to regain control. They just complied. I think they thought I would come at them with anger, that I'd use this win to punish, to humiliate, to drag our family name through the dirt. But I didn't. And that the restraint, the calm, it left them with nothing to push against, nothing to argue, nothing to weaponize. For the first time, they had to take me seriously. Not because I raised my voice, not because I demanded their attention, but because I moved without needing it. And when people who are used to your silence finally have to listen not to your words, but to your actions, they don't always know what to say, so they say nothing, and that, in its own way, was exactly what I needed to hear. The invitation was sent weeks before the court ruling, a glossy card with my name spelled correctly for once, folded into an envelope that tried too hard to feel warm. I hadn't RSVP'd. I hadn't responded at all. And I think, deep down, they assumed that meant I wouldn't come. But I did. Not out of spite. Not even to prove anything. I came because it was mine. 2. The family reunion wasn't held at some neutral venue, it was one of the properties from my grandfather's estate. The very land I now legally controlled. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I didn't arrive to remind them of that. I arrived to reclaim some Uthenquiter, my presence. When I walked in, no one rushed over. A few heads turned. One cousin paused, mid-laughed, my sister blinked like she'd seen a ghost, then, glanced down at her plate. I didn't make a scene. I found an empty chair near the center of the long dining table and sat down. Not at the head, not at the corner, just where I belonged. Conversations shifted gears. Forks slowed. People whispered behind napkins. I didn't comment. I didn't smile too wide or act overly gracious. I just passed the bread basket when it came to me and said thank you when someone filled my glass. And with every passing minute, I realized something. They didn't expect me to show up, but they also didn't know what to do now that I had. And that was enough for me. There's a certain kind of smile people wear when they've been caught in a truth they can't admit. That's what I saw all around the table. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in months grinned like we were still close. They asked shallow questions. How's work? How's the weather? How's the traffic? But never how I was actually doing. My brother made a joke about the seating arrangement. My sister asked if I wanted sparkling water or still. Polite, controlled, rehearsed. Like they were all performing a scene none of us had. Rehearsed enough for my father didn't greet me at all. He didn't even glance in my direction when I arrived, but I could feel it, the awareness, the shift in the room, the way his back straightened, the way he picked up his wine glass was just a little slower than usual. He was pretending he still held the floor. But his silence said everything. What struck me most was how the atmosphere bent without protest. No one asked why I was there. No one questioned my seat. They all adjusted, not because they wanted to, but because they understood, even if they'd never say it aloud. The discomfort wasn't loud, it was layered in eye contact that didn't last. In conversations that changed the moment I leaned in. In the way they laughed a little too hard at jokes that weren't funny. They weren't angry. They weren't apologetic either. They were unsettled. And trying not to show it. That's when I knew the power had shifted, and I didn't have to say a word to prove it. He tapped his glass gently, smiled at the room, and began what sounded like a speech he'd practiced in the mirror for years. All of us here, we're the branches of something strong, he said. This family, this land, this legacy. We've built it together. The words felt warm on the surface. But underneath, they were hollow-polished and distant, like a plaque on a wall. No one really reads anymore. He spoke about our family's values, about loyalty, tradition, and respect. He listed names of ancestors none of us knew, referenced stories only a few remembered. It was meant to bind us together. But what I heard was control, An attempt to reclaim a version of history where he was always the narrator. I watched him closely. Not for the words, those didn't matter. I watched for the cracks. The way his hand gripped the glass stem a little too tightly. The half-second pause when he mentioned legacy. The way his eyes kept flicking toward the end of the table. Toward me. He didn't say my name once. Not even in passing. It wasn't an oversight. It was a choice. He was trying to erase the shift. To speak, louder than the silence between us. But even he knew it wasn't working. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't make a face or whisper to anyone. I just listened. Calm, still waiting, because some truths don't need a rebuttal. They only need time. And a well-timed document in your bag. The speech ended. Applause came, scattered and unsure. People returned to their wine, their small talk, their carefully balanced plates. But I didn't join them. I reached down and unzipped the side pocket of my bag. Slow, quiet, deliberate. Inside was a folder. Thin, unmarked, unimpressive to anyone else. But to me, it was everything. A notarized truth. My grandfather's real intentions. The legacy my father tried to rewrite in silence. I didn't stand. I didn't announce anything. I didn't ask for attention. That's what they always expected from me, a need for permission, or approval. Not anymore. I slid the folder gently across the table, toward my father. The motion wasn't loud, but it cut through the room more sharply than any raised voice could have. He looked at it, at first, like it was an inconvenience, then a question, then something he recognized too quickly. He didn't open it right away. He just stared at the folder, like he was measuring the damage before it even happened. Around us, the conversation dimmed. Forks slowed, smiles tightened. No one knew what was in that folder, but they knew it mattered. They could feel it. Still, I said nothing. Because this moment wasn't about performance. It wasn't about humiliation or making a scene. It was about quiet restoration. Putting something back where it always should have been. I hadn't come here to fight. I came to place the truth on the table. And I had just done it. He finally reached for the folder. Not like someone claiming what was theirs. More like someone checking a wound they hoped wouldn't bleed. He opened it halfway. Read just enough. His hand paused at the second page. Then lowered it. His eyes lifted to mine. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise an eyebrow. I just met his gaze and said, calm, even, steady, you signed the wrong legacy. I wasn't accusing him. I wasn't begging for acknowledgement. I was just telling the truth out loud. Finally, around us, the room hushed. No clinking glasses. No whispering cousins. Even the background music seemed to retreat, like the walls themselves didn't want to interrupt. He didn't speak. Neither did my siblings. And that silence said everything. Because for once, I hadn't made myself small to keep the peace. I hadn't waited for permission to be real. I had brought my name to the table, and it sat heavier than any of theirs. I let that moment breathe. Not for them, for me, for the younger version of myself who once stood outside this family circle hoping to be let in, for the girl who believed being good would earn her a seat, not knowing she already had one. I didn't need a reply. The paper said enough. So did the silence. I didn't wait to see who spoke first. Once my father set the folder down, gently. Without a word, I knew there was nothing else for me at that table. I folded my napkin, stood slowly, thanked the host with a nod. No one moved. I didn't make a scene. Didn't clear my throat for attention. Didn't look for validation in anyone's eyes. Because this wasn't a performance. It was the end of a chapter I'd never agreed to be written into. I walked past my siblings, one pretending to check her phone, the other tracing his water glass like it held the right words. I passed my father's chair. He didn't look up, and I didn't give him the dignity of a farewell. He had already spent it. The exit was unremarkable. No one called after me. No wait, no we didn't know. Just the quiet shuffle of silverware behind me, people returning to their meals, or at least pretending to. But I didn't need dessert. I had finally tasted something better. Closure, served cold. Not with cruelty, but with clarity, and walking out on my own terms. That was the sweetest part. I didn't leave that reunion feeling powerful. I left feeling, free. For years, I thought I was fighting to sit at their table, to be seen, to be chosen, to be introduced without qualifiers, not our adopted one, not her, just family. But that table, it was never mine. It was a stage built on silence, where loyalty was conditional and love had terms, so no, I didn't sit at the head of it. And I didn't need to. I sat in my own truth, and that was enough. What I carried in that day wasn't just a legal document, it was a story corrected. A version of the past restored. Not for revenge. Not to humiliate anyone, just to put things back in place. They can keep the table. I've built something stronger. A quiet kind of peace that doesn't ask for permission. A legacy that doesn't rely on surnames or shared blood. And a voice that doesn't need to shout, because it finally believes itself. Walking out wasn't a victory march, it was a homecoming. Back to myself, in the months that followed, not a single message came through. No calls, no forwarded emails, no cards pretending they forgot my birthday by accident. At first, the silence was sharp. It echoed louder than any insult could have. I kept checking my phone, rereading old group texts that used to include me, wondering if I had missed something. If maybe they'd say something, not even to apologize, but just to acknowledge that I existed. But nothing came, and slowly, I stopped expecting it to. That silence. It didn't mean I'd failed. It meant they never really saw me. Not in the way that mattered. They only knew how to speak when they were being obeyed, or admired. And I wasn't giving them either anymore. There's a strange kind of peace that comes when you stop waiting for a knock that was never meant for your door. I didn't shut them out. They walked away when I stopped bending, and honestly, I'm glad they stayed gone. The house I bought wasn't big. It didn't have columns or a circular driveway or anything that would catch your eye from the road. But the first time I walked through it, I felt something loosen in my chest. It was quiet, not the kind of quiet that feels like you're being ignored, the kind that feels like you're finally alone with yourself. There was sunlight in every corner, even the kitchen. The floors creaked in a way that felt like memory, not disrepair. And there was one small room in the back that faced the trees, where I decided to paint the walls a soft, calming green. That became the room where I kept his books. My grandfather's books, the ones he let me take when I was 12, and swore I'd bring them back. I never did. And now I didn't have to. I didn't decorate the house to impress anyone. I didn't buy it to prove I'd made it. I bought it because it felt like somewhere I could exhale. The mailbox had my name on it, just mine. And for the first time, that didn't feel like an absence. It felt like a boundary. It was the first space in my life that didn't ask me to explain myself. No performance, no pretending. Just 4 walls, a roof, and a door I could lock behind me. And that was enough. It didn't take me long to decide where the money should go. Not all of it, just enough to make a point. Not to my family, to myself, and to him. There were places my grandfather cared about deeply, but rarely spoke of in detail. The old veterans library he donated to quietly, every year, a scholarship he set up in someone else's name, never his own. The wildlife preserve where he used to walk, hands behind his back like he was listening to something only he could hear. I started there. A donation to the library. Unrestricted so they could use it however they needed. A funding boost too. The scholarship, enough for a decade's worth of books. And a bench at the preserve, near his favorite trail. It didn't have a nameplate. Just a view. I didn't want applause. I didn't even put my name on most of the paperwork. But I signed every check with a kind of stillness in my hands that I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't charity. This was recognition and honoring. For the man who gave without needing credit, and for the girl he once told, "You'll understand when it's your turn to give." Now it was at first. I kept checking my phone not constantly, but often enough to notice the silence. Birthdays passed. Holidays, no messages, no calls, not even the half-hearted ones with clipped voices and forced affection. I used to think that kind of silence meant failure. Like I hadn't tried hard enough to hold the family together. But now, I see it for what it is. Relief. A clearing. Their absence stopped aching when I stopped assigning it value, when I stopped holding space for people who had never truly stood beside me. It wasn't peace I was missing. It was the performance of being included. And I no longer needed the invitation to feel whole. Some family ties don't snap, all at once. They wear thin over years. Little cuts, forgotten moments, unspoken betrayals. Until one day, there's nothing left to repair, and you realize that maybe it was never a bond. Maybe it was a cord wrapped around your chest, keeping you small. Letting go wasn't dramatic. It didn't need an announcement or a door slammed. Shut, it just faded. And in that quiet, I found more room for my own voice. They didn't call. And for once, I didn't need them to. There's only one photo framed in my new house. It sits above my desk. Simple wood, no gold trim, no ornate matting, just him, my grandfather. Hands folded, smile faint but steady, the kind of smile that never asked for attention, it simply gave comfort. It's not a dramatic portrait, not even a posed one, but it carries more weight than all the family albums combined. Beneath the photo, I had a small brass plaque engraved. It says, "You are always mine." Not mine in the way people claim ownership. Mine in the way a child means when they say, "He listens to me." Mine, as in safe. As in chosen. As in seen. That picture doesn't remind me of what I lost. It reminds me of what never left. There were times, growing up, when I felt like a guest in my own home, like love was something I had to earn, by being helpful, being quiet, being less. But in his presence, I never had to be anything more than myself. I don't visit his grave often, but I speak to this photo every day. A word, a nod, a moment of stillness, and when I pass by it each morning, I remember that real love doesn't need to shout to be heard. It simply stays. I used to think family was something fixed, something printed on a birth certificate, sealed in legal ink, defined by who clapped at your school play or signed your report cards. But now I know better. Family isn't who shares your last name. It's who shows up when the world quietly shuts its door on you. It's who remembers your favorite kind of tea, or notices when your voice is softer than usual. It's the person who listens without planning their response. The one who believes you not because you proved it, but because they never needed you to. Some of the deepest betrayals in my life came from people I once called mine, but I've learned that letting go isn't bitterness. It's clarity. It's setting down the weight of expectations that were never met. Today, my family looks different. It includes a neighbor who drops off baked bread when she has extra, a former coworker who texts once a week just to ask if I'm sleeping okay, and the lawyer who reminded me that strategy can be quiet, but powerful. The people who matter now aren't trying to reclaim a title, they're just ... They're steady, honest, present. I don't need to rewrite the past. I just needed to stop confusing proximity with love, and with that, the story, my story, finally feels like it belongs to me.